This is a production by the World History Since the 15th Century class at London Christian High 2021.
Hello, I'm Kaylin.
And I'm Grace Ann.
Together we have created this podcast series about the history of South Africa from 1600 to 1900. We have researched a lot about this topic and are excited to share our knowledge with you. South Africa has a complex and intriguing history. In the following episodes, you'll learn about the establishment of the Dutch and British colonies, the company ruled by the Dutch East India Company, an increase of settlers coming into the region, the Boer Wars, impactful treaties, and many other significant events. Along the way, we'll share with you the many causes and effects these events had on South Africa and the people living there.
As we are covering a colonial experience, we would like to give a content warning to our listeners. We will be talking about racism, abuse, slavery, and discrimination. We would also like to give you a quick disclaimer. We are not a voice for the South African people. We are basing our research on archaeological and written historic evidence. We would also like to acknowledge that this is not our history and that these stories are not our stories. This is not a place whose background we share, but we are hoping to use our research skills to share this lesser-known history and in an effort to foster community and understanding. We have tried our best to present you with accurate facts in an unbiased and respectful manner. However, we apologize if we have made any errors or if we mispronounce any words, names, or terms.
Thank you for being interested in our podcast series and this topic. We encourage you to find out more.
This series is set up as this is a news story series by our fictional news station, Afrikaner News, and we will be using some fictional characters in this series.
Good morning, I'm Shay Knight.
And I'm Jane Merriweather. You're listening to
Afrikaner News, South Africa's news station that is dedicated to providing you with the news that you need to know.
Today is April 27, 2015, South Africa's Independence Day, otherwise known as Freedom Day. In honor of this significant day, we will be launching a series diving deep into the history of our country. You'll learn about the colonialism, wars, treaties, and movements that took place in South Africa from 1600 to 1900. We'll also cover the social, political, religious, intellectual, technological, and economic causes and consequences of these events. We'll share with you some primary sources, have interviews with knowledgeable experts, and analyze big picture patterns and trends. Our goal with this series is to educate our listeners about our country's interesting and complex history.
As we begin our series, we'd like to bring everyone up to speed about what South Africa was like prior to the 1600s, to ensure that all of our listeners have a good understanding of South Africa and its people, geography, and culture before the 1600s, the time period our second episodes begin at.
South Africa is the most southern region of the African continent. You can find a map of the region attached to the transcript.
Africa has a large variety of climates and weather patterns. Prior to the 1600s, the climate and weather patterns made migration necessary for the people who lived there. The situation was similar to South Africa. South Africa is located at the bottom of the continent and has a prominent cape. The cape is located astride the main ship route to the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. The Cape was great for agriculture and there were not many diseases. These conditions along the Cape's perfect location along various shipping routes. This made it an ideal location for the Europeans to move into, which is what they did, as you'll learn in our next episode.
However, the Europeans weren't the first foreigners to create establishments for themselves in this region. South Africa's first arrivals, the Portuguese, came back in 1488. They traveled there on their ships and took control of the Cape Sea route. In 1497, Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, landed on the Natal coast. However, no major events occurred and the area was relatively undisturbed.
Now we're talking a lot about other nations that traveled to South Africa. But what about the Afrikaners? Unlike some people believe, South Africa wasn't a barren, unclaimed land. The Cape was already inhabited long before explorers ever set foot there. At the beginning of the 1600s, two major groups of native Afrikaners were living there, the Khoikhoi and the San.
The Khoikhoi, who were also called Hottentots by the Dutch, kept cattle and lived in chiefdoms. Due to South Africa's climate and their jobs as cattle raisers, the Khoikhoi regularly migrated to different pastures.
The San were foragers, and they lived in small bands. They lived in the mountains and lands that were not too dry. The San had very flexible societies. The ability they had to live on the mountain proved to be helpful to them when resisting the Dutch expansion, which you'll learn about later on in our series.
This takes us up to the 1600s, the time period where we'll begin our second episode. However, before we continue with this series, we'd like to share with you the cultural disruption that occurred in South Africa and its impact on our knowledge of its people prior to the 1600s.
Unfortunately, in the following decades, South Africa and its people endured a lot of cultural disruption, which we'll cover in details in the following episodes. This disruption had a profound impact on South Africa's people, culture, and the passing on of information. You see, in South Africa, like many African cultures, storytellers were responsible for passing on information. This is known as oral tradition. Storytellers were considered vital for cultures to be healthy and strong. If cultural disruption, such as colonization, hint hint for our next episodes, cut off one generation from the next, all the knowledge could be lost. Since there is hardly any written information in South Africa, this indeed was the case.
The methods by which various technologies were crafted were also passed down orally. So, much of that information was lost in the colonization process.
Essentially, all this means that most of the Africans' pre-colonial history has been erased, and that the scientific, technological, cultural, and archaeological advancements from this time period have no physical evidence.
This erase of culture and history has, and still is, very damaging to South Africa and its people. It has also led to the common misconception that no advancements, political systems, or technologies were created in the region. However, that is not the case. In contrast, many advancements were made, particularly in medicine. Africans had many medical practices and lots of knowledge that weren't seen in Europe for a long time afterwards, such as smallpox immunizations and C-section procedures. A lot of skilled metalworking also occurred in this area, which has also been lost.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you learned a lot about South Africa prior to the 1600s. We are so grateful for your interest in this topic, and we encourage you to find out more. The sources we used for this episode are BBC's news article, South Africa Profile Timeline, an article from the Encyclopedia Britannica called South Africa, the book South African History from Prehistory to Present, the 3rd edition, a video from History Summarized titled Africa, and an image from Britannica Image Quest. Be sure to give our next episode a listen to hear what occurred in South Africa during the 17th century. For Afrikaner News, I'm Shay Knight.
And I'm Jane Merriweather. This is a production of the World History Since the 15th Century class at London Christian High 2021.
Hello, I'm Caitlin.
And I'm Grace Ann.
Together we have created this podcast series about the history of South Africa from 1600 to 1900. We have researched a lot about this topic and we are excited to share our knowledge with you. South Africa has a complex and intriguing history. In this series, we'll cover the establishment of the Dutch and British colonies, the company rule by the British East India Company, an increase in settlements coming into a new region, the Boer Wars, impactful treaties, and many other significant events. Along the way, we'll share with you many causes and effects that these events had on South Africa and the people living there.
As we are covering a colonial experience, we would like to give a content warning to our listeners. We will be talking about racism, abuse, slavery, and discrimination.
Before we continue with the episode, we would like to give a quick disclaimer. We are not the voice of the South African people. We are basing our information on archaeological and historical evidence. We would also like to acknowledge that this is not our history and these are not our stories. This is not a place whose background we share, but we are hoping to use our research skills to share this lesser-known history in an effort to foster community and understanding. We have tried our best to present you with accurate facts in an unbiased and respectful manner. However, we apologize if we have made any errors, if we mispronounce words, names, or terms.
Thank you for your interest in our podcast series and this topic. We encourage you to find out more.
This series is set up as if it were a news story series by our fictional news station, Afrikaner News, and we will be using some fictional characters for this series. Good morning, I'm Shay Knight.
And I'm Jay Merriweather, and you're listening to
Afrikaner News. South Africa's news station that is dedicated to providing you with the news you need to know. This is our second episode in honor of South Africa's Independence Day. In the last episode, we went over South Africa's prior to the 1600s. In this episode, we'll be informing you about colonies founded by the British and Dutch East Indian Company, their expansion as well as the conflict and increasing tensions in the region.
As we've covered in our first episode, South Africa's first arrivals, the Portuguese, came to this region back in 1488 and took control over the Cape Sea route. In 1497, Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, landed on the Natal coast. However, no major events occurred, and the area was relatively undisturbed.
This all changed in the early 17th century, when the region grabbed the attention of the Dutch and British, who both set their forces to the region.
Up until this point, European powers didn't see South Africa as a great location. Besides, the Portuguese had some influence there already. However, in 1602, the Dutch East India Company formed, and by 1620, the British had founded a small settlement by Table Bay.
In 1652, a group of settlers were landed in Jan van Riebeeck, a representative of the Dutch East India Company. A group founded the Cape Colonies at Table Bay, which is now modern-day Cape Town. The idea was for them to build a port and run some farms so that they could restock Dutch ships when they sailed by. This was set up by the Dutch East India Company. Later in the year, the Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC, stationed a garrison near Table Mountain. For those of you who don't know, a garrison is a group of troops whose role is to guard a town or a city. The Dutch East India Company's garrison role was to provide the company's fleet traveling through the region and to protect the settlement. At this time, the company's settlement grew rapidly, so much so that in 1657, 9 men were granted land along the Liesbreek River to farm, which was outside the settlement's original territory. This was due to a lack of resources. In the following years, a series of crop failures resulted in settlers venturing further into South Africa in order to farm enough food for the settlement. The diseases were spread to the local Khoikhoi people, leaving more farmland available.
In 1657 and 1658, the first slaves were imported to the Cape. They arrived from West Africa, East Africa, the Malay Peninsula, and India, as the Dutch East India Company made it clear that local Afrikaners were not to be enslaved.
Diamond vendor Stella took over the colonies in 1679. Under his leadership, farming growth became an active policy.
In 1685, the Edict of Fontainebleau was established in France by King Louis XIV. It evicted Protestants from France. As a result, many refugees came to settle in the Cape. In the following years, the colony continued to expand.
The Dutch East India Company was unhappy about the expansion and growth that occurred. It wasn't the reason the colony was planted. As we said earlier, the goal of the settlement was simply to harbor and pit stop for the company's ship. In response to the sudden expansion, the company implemented policies that cut down migration. They set rules about what the farmers were required to provide and forced them to provide the products to only the company. Because the company was so far away, there weren't many representatives to force settlers to comply. As a result, the rules and regulations were not really followed. Boer farmers didn't listen, and the colony kept expanding, with farmers going further and further inland to acquire more farmland. At this time, the Dutch imposed heavy taxation on them, which, as you can imagine, was not well received.
The significant amount of colonial expansion in the eastern and northern parts of the Cape had a severe impact on the Khoikhoi and the San. Many of these groups were pushed out of land they had lived on and used for centuries. The conquest of the Khoikhoi people also occurred at this time. Tensions grew between settlers, natives, and slaves, as did racism, discrimination, and division. By the 1760s, the Khoikhoi and slaves had to carry passes.
At this time, we'd like to share an intriguing primary source with you, a labeled map of Cape of Good Hope. It is attached to the transcript of this episode. The map itself was created in 1680. The image came from Britannica Image Quest, although the copyrights of this image are to Wellcome Trust Library.
There is a lot of information we can gather from this map. The map is extremely detailed with a fancy title and depictions of a coast with a ship and a settlement. The coast drawn on the map has some large mountains. Although the author is unknown, a Dutch flag on a pole is drawn standing on the shore, which suggests the map was created by a Dutch source. There is also some sort of settlement located at the base of the mountains. We know that the Dutch East India Company stationed a garrison near the base of Table Mountain. Perhaps this may be an image of that. After all, Table Mountain is located right by the coast, at Cape Town. Furthermore, the mountains drawn on the map resemble images of Table Mountain. An image of Table Mountain is also provided in the transcript, so our listeners can compare themselves. The map has a neat legend and is drawn with many locations on it. On the bottom right corner, there appears to be some sort of compass drawn, and an image of a cove is drawn on the bottom left corner. The cove suggests that the creator of the map had some involvement in that specific area. The cove itself is located at the southern tip of South Africa. The southern tip also has a large number of labels. This provides more support for the theory that this map was produced for or by the Dutch East India Company, as they had a harbor in the area. Unfortunately, most of the text is too small and pixelated to read.
This brings us to the late 1700s. At this time, Britain realized the Cape's value and decided to conquer it. In 1795, the British took the Cape Colony from the Netherlands and independent governments were set up. Sir James Henry Craig got Cape Town to surrender through a series of threats. He also sent armies to subdue the farmers.
The British takeover did nothing to resolve the unrest filling the country. It only increased it. From 1799 to 1803, a Khoikhoi rebellion took place in Eastern Cape.
The Cape Colony's territory was returned to the Dutch in 1803. However, by 1806, the Cape Colony territory was given up to the British once again. In the 1814s, the colony was surrendered to Britain by the Dutch. This sets the stage for much more conflict and division in the following decades. You'll learn more about this and much more in our next episode.
That was a wonderful episode with a lot of interesting information. It is clear that imperialism and colonialism were both very prevalent in South Africa at the time. I'm joined today by Miss Joyce Abera. She's a professor at the University of London and teaches classes in world history, philosophy, and social sciences. Miss Abera, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to hear about what you have to say about the large-scale patterns and trends we saw in this news story. Could you give our listeners a bit more information about the significance of the events we just learned about?
Absolutely. We can see a lot of overarching concepts and patterns taking place in South Africa at this time, especially when it comes to imperialism and colonialism.
Before you continue, Ms. Avera, would you please remind our listeners what imperialism and colonialism actually are?
Of course. Imperialism is the process of a state attempting to control the economic, political, and cultural makeup of another state. Colonialism is a developed form of imperialism, where the controlling state invades another state with the purpose of exploiting its resources for a large-scale immigration. Many European powers were very imperialistic and colonialistic at this time, as we see in the time period as the Netherlands and the British.
Why do you think that was? Didn't their leaders care about the people's homes they were invading?
Well, that is a bit of a tricky question, Miss Merriweather. As historians, we need to look at the past with some historical perspective. That means we need to look at the circumstances at the time of the creation of the source. Both society and belief systems. You see, these invading powers had many reasons by which they were justifying their actions. Some claimed they had legal and religious obligations to take over, or that it was the natives' best interest. Others brought up the racial arguments that the natives were subhuman. Cultural arguments were also voiced, as they were supposedly inferior cultures that would benefit from the European influence. We also need to remember that these powers were coming out of the age of exploration. These arguments were not new. For many years before it, these powers had been going on to other territories for resources, to plant colonies, for trade, and for mission work.
Wow, that was indeed a lot of great information. You brought up colonialism quite a lot. Could you touch on what colonialism was experienced in South Africa at the time?
Absolutely. There are four main types of colonial rule that were exercised during the Imperial Age: company rule, direct rule, indirect rule, and settler rule. Company rule was particularly prevalent in the region at the time, under the influence of the Dutch East India Company.
Why is that so? Wouldn't the countries themselves want to plant the colonies?
That is an amazing question, Miss Merriweather. Actually, both the European powers and the private companies benefited from the company rule. European powers provided charters for these companies, and the private companies set up their own systems of taxation and labor recruitment. Company rule gave European countries political benefit in having additional colonies without the expense.
That sounds like a great system for the imperialistic powers.
In many ways it was. However, company rule wasn't very successful in the long run, as it wasn't financially viable. By 1924, all company rule was replaced by a form of European colonial government.
Very interesting stuff. Before we let you go, Miss Abera, could you share with us any other major patterns and important trends we can see in South Africa throughout this time period?
Of course, there's a lot of complex patterns and trends that were impacted by previous events, and trends that continue to impact the region for the following years. Cause and consequence is another historical thinking concept that we need to keep in mind. All events have multiple causes and multiple consequences, and are influenced by a wide variety of factors. In South Africa, we can see how a lot of settlers were coming into Cape Town at the time, and that impacted the political system in the following years, something that I'm sure you will talk about in your next episodes. We've also seen how tensions have been steadily increasing between the Afrikaners, settlers, and European leaders. The two have had a large impact on South Africa in the following years.
Thank you for your time and insights. I'm afraid that's all the time we have left for today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Miss Joyce Abera, a professor at the University of London who specializes in world history, philosophy, and social sciences. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you learned a lot about what occurred in South Africa from 1600 to 1800. A lot of significant events occurred. The establishment of the British and Dutch colonies, company rule enforced by the Dutch East India Company, conflict between the Dutch, British, and Afrikaners, as well as an increase in settlement and trade in the region. All of this set the stage for much more conflict and division in the following decades, as we'll cover in the following episodes, so be sure to give those a listen.
We are so grateful for your interest in this topic, and we always encourage you to find more. The sources we used for today's episode are History of South Africa, Episode 1, The Beginning, the book Africa in World History, From Prehistory to Present, Britannica's article titled South Africa, History Summarized, Britannica Image Quest, BBC News' article South Africa Profile Timeline, and the book The Making of Modern South Africa Conquest, Apartheid Democracy in the 4th edition. Be sure to give our next episode a listen to hear about what occurred in South Africa from 1850 to 1880. For Afrikaner News, I am Shay Knight.
And I'm Jane Merriweather. This is a production of the World History since the 15th Century class at London Christian High 2021.
Hello, I'm Kaylin.
And I'm Roseanne.
Together we have created this podcast series about the history of South Africa from 1600 to 1900. We have researched a lot about this topic and are excited to share our knowledge with you. South Africa has a complex and intriguing history. In this series, we'll cover the establishment of the Dutch and British colonies, the company ruled by the Dutch East India Company, an increase in settlers coming from other regions, the Boer Wars, impactful treaties, and many other significant events. Along the way, we'll share with you the many causes and effects it had on South Africa and the people living there.
As we are covering a colonial experience, we would like to give a content warning to our listeners. We will be talking about racism, abuse, slavery, and discrimination.
Before we continue with the episode, we would like to give you a quick disclaimer, as we are not the voice of the South African people. We are basing our information on archaeological and written historical evidence. We would also like to acknowledge that this is not our history, and these stories are not our stories. This is not a place whose background we share, but we are hoping to use your research skills to share this lesser-known history in an effort to foster community and understanding. We have tried our best to present you with accurate facts with an unbiased and respectful manner. However, we apologize if we make any errors or if we mispronounce any words, names, or terms.
Thank you for your interest in our podcast series and this topic. We encourage you to find out more.
This series is set up as if it was a news story series by our fictional news station, Afrikaner News, and we will be using some fictional characters in this series. Good morning, I'm Shay Knight.
And I'm Jane Merriweather, and you're listening to
Afrikaner News, South Africa's news station that is dedicated to providing you with the news that you need to know. This is our third episode in honor of South Africa's Independence Day. In the last episode, we covered the establishment of the Dutch and British colonies, company rule enforced by the Dutch East India Company, the conflict between the Dutch, British, and Afrikaners, and also an increase in settlement and trade in the region.
Today, we will be talking about the period from 1800 to approximately the beginning triggers of the Second Boer War in 1881. In 1806, the British took over the Dutch colonies. Originally, these were run by the Dutch Boer people, as we learned about in our second episode, and the British rampaged and took over, which, as you can imagine, made the Boer people very upset as they forced them to live underneath the British rule, which did not work out very well for either side of this ruling.
Eventually, the two colonies did end up separating in 1814, and was to the Dutch-Anglo Treaty, which officially stated that the British had the right and possession to the Cape Colony. This caused a lot of separations between the colonies. Many of the Dutch people did not want to be under British rule, so many of the colonies went back to the Netherlands. The Dutch citizens, also known as the Boer people, who did not leave, stuck around and tried to stick it out in the Cape Colonies. They tried to live under the British rule for 19 years.
In 1833, after everything did not work out, surprise, surprise, the Boer went on the Great Trek, where many of the Boer people decided to travel inland and start their own states without the British. They settled in Transvaal and the Orange Free State. There was a lot of good and bad to this trek. The Boer were able to start their own colonies again and be out of British rule. They did have to start over, which meant that they were really starting from scratch in their lives. While they were living there, they had a lot of issues because they were cut off from the rest of the world. They became very isolated and were not super aware of what was happening in the rest of the world. And that's why we see things like the Enlightenment and so on not affecting these people.
In 1867, diamonds were found in Africa, which, as we can imagine, leads to a lot of chaos around the area because everybody wanted the diamonds and gold. As diamonds and gold were found, chaos and greed unfold all across South Africa. This leads to more hatred around the country between colonies. For 10 years, they have an endless cycle of greed and hatred.
In 1877, we saw the annexation of South Africa by the British unfold. The Boer people were very unhappy about this, but they ended up complaining because they were very fearful of the Zulu people. The Zulu people, who were a native group to Africa, were recently conquered by the British people. So the Boer people complied with the annex out of fear. With the annex, the Boer people did still have some independence, but the British still had overall power. The Boer were unhappy, but they had to deal with it civilly.
From 1880 to 1881, the First Boer War took place, also known as the Transvaal Rebellion. This is a very sudden war that both sides were unprepared for, but the British were at a large disadvantage as they were unprepared but also naive about the Boer armies.
The Boer people were very quick to attack, and they immediately went to war. All male citizens between 16 and 60 were called to war. The Boer people were able to overcome fairly quickly as they knew the land. So when the British fled, the Boer people were able to overcome them as the British wore red coats, which we all can imagine stand out in the desert and dry climate of South Africa. The Boer people were also able to follow the British very easily as they knew land much better than the British. The First Boer War stopped after Major General Pomeroy Colley of England was killed by the Boer people. This was the first war that the British have lost in years upon years. So it's a bit humiliating for them. So they agreed to make a treaty with the Boer at this point.
In 1881, they signed the Pretoria Convention, which transferred complete control over Boers' personal affairs back to them, but the British still had seniority, meaning they still had the ultimate control over the Boer people.
With all of these conflicts never fully settled, we will see a consistent pattern heading into our next episode, fighting between the two states. The discovery of gold in South Africa largely affected South Africa and caused a lot of conflict to unfold in the following decades. The consequences of these continued conflicts started to majorly affect the Boer and British in 1899. The Pretoria Convention has more negative effects than good. This treaty is what eventually caused the unraveling into the Second Boer War. With all of this action, we still do not see much change take place. In the next episode, we will see large amounts of change occur.
Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you learned a lot about what occurred in South Africa from 1600 to 1800. A lot of conflict goes down between the British and Boer people, and this will only continue next episode. While the First Boer War, in the large scheme of everything, was not a major war, it did greatly affect the Second Boer War, as we'll cover in the following episode. So be sure to give those a listen. We're grateful for your interest in our topic, and we encourage you to find out more. The sources we've used for this episode are Britain Takes Control of the Cape from South Africa History Online, South Africa from Britannica, A Brief History of the Boer Wars from YouTube, and South Africa's Profile from BBC. For Afrikaner News, I'm Shay Knight.
And I'm Jane Merriweather. This is a production of the World History Since the 15th Century class at London Christian High 2021.
Hello, I'm Kaylin.
And I'm Grace Ann.
And together we have created this podcast series about the history of South Africa from 1600 to 1900. We have researched a lot about this topic and are excited to share our knowledge with you. South Africa has this intriguing and complex history. In this series, we will cover the establishment of the Dutch and British colonies, the company ruled by the Dutch East India Company, the increase of settlers coming to the region, the Boer Wars, impactful treaties, and many other significant events. Along the way, we'll share with you the many causes and effects these events have on South Africa and the people living there.
As we This is a production of the World History Since the 15th Century class at London Christian High 2021.
Hello, I'm Kaylin.
And I'm Grace Ann.
Together we've created this podcast series about the history of South Africa from 1600 to 1900. We've researched a lot about this topic and we are excited to share our knowledge with you. South Africa has a complex and intriguing history.
As we are covering a colonial experience, we would like to give a content warning to our listeners. We will be talking about racism, abuse, slavery, and discrimination. Before we continue with our episode, we would like to give you a quick disclaimer. We are not a voice for the South African people. We are basing our information on archaeological and written historic evidence. We would also like to acknowledge that this is not our history, and that these stories are not our stories. This is not a place whose background we share, but we are hoping to use our research skills to share this lesser-known history and in an effort to foster community and understanding. We have tried our best to present you with accurate facts in an unbiased and respectful manner. However, we apologize if we have made any errors or if we mispronounce any words, names, or terms.
Thank you for your interest in our podcast series and this topic, and we always encourage you to find out more.
These podcasts are set up as if this is a news story series by our fictional news station, Afrikaner News, and we will be using some fictional characters in this series.
Good morning, I'm Shay Knight.
And I'm Jane Merriweather, and you're listening to
Afrikaner News, South Africa's news station that is dedicated to providing you with the news that you need to know.
This is our 5th and final episode in our series in honor of South Africa's Independence Day. Throughout the past 4 episodes, we have covered the colonialism, wars, treaties, and movements that took place in South Africa from 1600 to 1900. We also went over the social, political, religious, intellectual, technological, and economic causes and consequences of these events. We shared with you some primary sources, had interviews with knowledgeable experts, and analyzed big picture patterns and trends. Our goal with this series has been to educate our listeners about our country's interesting and complex history.
In this final episode, we are going to review what we learned and educate our listeners on these significant events that took place after 1900.
In episode 1, we talked about what South Africa was like before it was colonized. We also mentioned the cultural disruption that took place in South Africa and its devastating impact on its people's methods of passing on their knowledge, traditions, history, and culture.
In episode 2, we went over how the country was impacted when the Dutch East India Company was set post there,
and
when the British developed settlements there. We learned how local Afrikaners were impacted and how tensions rose. We analyzed a primary source and spoke about the larger patterns and trends that took place in South Africa from 1600 to 1800, such as colonialism, imperialism, and different types of colonial rule. All these events and factors set up the stage for much more conflict and division in the following decades.
In episode 3, we looked at the British takeover of the Cape Colony, how the Boers were impacted by living under British rule, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814, the Great Trek of 1833, and the First Boer War. We looked at the political, social, cultural, racial, and economic impacts of colonialism on various groups of people.
In episode 4, we covered the events that took place in South Africa from 1881 to 1900. We looked at continued unrest in the region and minor fighting between states, which was often caused by the British. We went over the British attempts to capture larger Boer cities, a guerrilla war that was launched by the Boer, as well as the peace treaty of Vereeniging, and its lasting impact on South Africa and the world. We also analyzed the many patterns and trends from this time period.
The social, political, religious, intellectual, technological, and economic impacts of the events we covered in the past 4 episodes were severe and continued well beyond the 1900s, impacting us today. At this time, we would like to share with you some significant events that occurred in South Africa after 1900.
To the relief of many people, the Boer War ended in 1902, and South Africa experienced some much-needed peace. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed, marking the new age in the country's politics, as did the establishment of the Native National Congress of 1921. The Congress was renamed the African National Congress shortly after.
Although a lot of positive political and economic growth happened after the end of the Boer War, a lot of racism remained. In 1913, the Land Act was passed. It prevented blacks from buying land that was outside reserves. The new Land Act had a profound impact on many Afrikaners and highlighted divisions between groups of people. The National Party was founded in 1914.
In 1918, the Secret Brotherhood was founded. This helped the Afrikaner cause. People used it to fight back against the racist restrictions that governments had put in place.
In the year of 1934, the British gave up all their legal authority in South Africa. South Africa became its own independent state.
The apartheid took place over the next few decades. Its impact was felt strongly throughout the country and continent. It began in 1948 when the National Party took power and adopted the apartheid policies. It resulted in a lot of systematic segregation. The population was classified by race. It was at this time that Nelson Mandela led many impactful movements in opposition, until he was detained and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964.
In 1961, South Africa left the Commonwealth and declared itself a republic.
In 1996, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began hearing about the human rights crimes that were committed by former governments during the time of the apartheid. It was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. At the beginning of the 2000s, a new movement focused on seeking the truth overtook South Africa.
In the early 2000s, many government-run programs were set up to stop the spread of AIDS.
In 2009, an economic recession hit the country, and this had a hard effect on many Afrikaner families.
In 2010, a nationwide strike was held by civil servants.
Through the decade, a lot of trouble and corruption occurred within the African National Congress. This had a negative impact on many Afrikaners.
That concludes our final episode of this series. This has been a very exciting and eye-opening series for the both of us, and we hope you have learned a great deal as well. A lot of significant events occurred that still impact South Africa today. Thank you for your interest in this subject and your support of this series.
We'd like to give special thanks to our classmates for editing our work and providing us with helpful feedback, and to our teacher for her support and encouragement. We're so grateful for your interest in this topic, and we encourage you to find out more. For this episode, we used information from BBC's article South Africa Profile Timeline. For Afrikaner News, I am Shay Knight.
And I'm Jane Merriweather.